All right. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Vonnie. As they said, my name is Chris Eyler. I am the U.S. Chamber's Vice President for the Northwest region. Again, my role is to work with Vonnie and her colleagues at all of the state and local chambers of commerce in the states of Oregon, Alaska, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. We do this as part of our advocacy work because we want to make sure that our local and state chamber partners are looped in on what we are doing on behalf of the business community back in Washington, D.C., but more importantly, to make sure that we're getting input from you to inform our advocacy efforts. What makes us such an effective advocacy and trade association back in DC is because we can point to the support of our state and local partners. So I want to just begin by thanking you for supporting our work in DC and supporting the work of Vonnie and the Springfield area chamber here in Oregon. So today I'm going to give you a very broad general overview of the challenges that the business community is facing at the national level, both from an economic point of view as well as, and more importantly, from a political point of view. When it comes to the economy, and the other panelists are going to get into a lot more granular data than I am, I'm sure, but when it comes to the economy, our economists at the US Chamber will describe things generally as weird. Everyone is waiting for this recession to come along that just doesn't seem to come along. But there are a number of good things going on, but when you look under the numbers, there are a lot of things indicating that we are indeed starting to move. The economy is slowing, and we likely will experience a recession at some point later this year. But we keep getting relatively good economic data, particularly in the jobs market. We just saw on Friday, in April, the economy created 253,000 jobs. This follows 236,000 jobs in March, 311,000 in February, and 517,000 in January. What more, we have gained back all of the jobs that we lost during the pandemic. In fact, we now have more jobs than we did in February of 2020. However, the participation rate continues to lag. In fact, if we had the same participation rate now that we did in February 2020, we would have 1.8 million more workers in the workforce. Next slide, please. This is, as a lot of you know, who are hiring employees, if it's already experienced, there is a significant lack of available qualified workers in the workforce. Right now, there are 9.59 million job openings in the US compared to 5.84 million unemployed, meaning there's roughly 3.75 million jobs without any available workers. Here in Oregon, you have 140,000 job openings compared to 103,000 unemployed. When we take into factors like the quit rate, the hire rate, and the participation rate, we estimate that for every 100 jobs there are open in Oregon, there's only 91 available workers. Next slide, please. What more? Well, it's good. Wages are growing. They're not growing as fast as inflation. And inflation is beginning to come down. It is at 5%, which is off the 9.1% high we saw last summer. But as long as inflation is outpacing wage growth, that just erodes consumers' purchasing power. Next slide, please. Consumer spending is largely keeping the economy going. And a lot of this is being driven by the fact that consumers built up nearly $3 trillion in excess savings during the pandemic shutdowns, but they are spending down that savings rapidly, and they now have a lower savings than they did prior to the pandemic. Next slide. And to make up for the fact that they've burnt down all their savings, they're carrying larger and larger balances on their credit cards. Next slide. So given all of this, and I recognize this is a very generalized summary, we are now starting to see some slowing in the economy. After fairly robust growth during 2022, which came in at 2.1%, 2.8% in the fourth quarter, the economy slowed somewhat in the first quarter of 2023 to 1.1%. We had estimated that it would come in at 1.7%, so we were off quite a bit. It's actually slowing faster than we expected. And as I indicated at the top of my presentation, we fully expect that at some point in the third or fourth quarter, the economy is going to experience a mild recession, which is largely going to be driven by the fact that inflation has finally caught up to consumers They've burnt down their savings and their wages aren't keeping up with inflation and they just cannot keep spending. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about the political headwinds that businesses are facing. We all saw following the November elections, Republicans retook control of the House of Representatives. They now have a 222 seat to 213 seat majority in the House. Incidentally, that is nearly identical to the majority that Democrats had in the previous Congress. And Democrats in the Senate expanded their majority by 1 seat, and they now have a 51 seat to 49 seat majority in the US Senate. So we have a situation where we have divided government. Anything that moves is going to require bipartisan support. What more, we still have this requirement in the Senate where you need to get 60 votes to get cloture to move anything to final passage. Next slide, please. But what we are seeing as far as trends go over the past 20 years is that things are becoming, this polarization, this instability at the federal level is becoming the norm. Between 1960 and the year 2000, there were 20 election cycles. And in those 20 election cycles, only 7 of those cycles actually resulted in any kind of change in control of government, meaning control of the House went from Democrats to Republicans, or control of the Senate went from Democrat to Republican, or vice versa, or the White House changed control. Only 7 elections resulted in any kind of change in control of government between 1960 and 2020. Since 2020, there have been 12 election cycles, and 10 of those election cycles have resulted in some kind of change in control of government. What this means and why this is significant, when you look at legislation between 1960 and the year 2000, you see a pattern where lawmakers are much more willing to reach across the aisle. They're more willing to look for compromise. There's a greater willingness to work together to get big things done. Since the year 2000, you're not seeing that as much. Lawmakers, if they're in the minority party, are increasingly willing to just wait it out to the next election cycle, thinking, well, if I just sit tight, we'll be in the majority of the next Congress and we can do what we want then. As a result, you're not seeing a lot of bills passed with big bipartisan majorities. You're seeing less and less willingness between lawmakers to reach across the aisle and work in a bipartisan way. Next slide, please. Additionally, we're seeing fewer and fewer competitive congressional districts. At the beginning of the 21st century, on average, there were 77 congressional districts where voters voted for a member of Congress from one party and a presidential candidate from the other party. That average has fallen to 20 congressional seats in the last 2 election cycles. Next slide, please. Voters also are increasingly more and more cynical about government. In a recent NBC poll, 7 out of 10 Americans said that government is so divided that it cannot solve our nation's problems. That is up significantly from 2010 when that poll showed 45% of Americans felt that way. Next slide, please. And then overall, 64.3% of Americans polled say the country is on the wrong track. Now, albeit that is down from 75% last summer, but it is still a significantly bad number, a high number of Americans who think we're on the wrong track. So what does this all mean for business? Next slide, please. We at the U.S. Chamber have been increasingly curious about how is all of this instability and all this polarization at the federal level impacting businesses? And so what we did is we took all of the 10K filings of businesses that filed 10Ks with the SEC and looked at them between 2011 and 2021 and tallied up how frequently are businesses in those filings mentioning public policy concerns as a concern for the operations in their business. And what we observed is between 2021 or 2011 and 2021, instances where businesses cite things like data privacy, immigration issues, labor, intellectual property, and other public policy concerns has increased 27%. Concerns about economic conditions have remained stable and relatively flat, but in that period of time, they've increasingly become more and more concerned about what is going on in Washington, D.C., both in Congress as well as in federal agencies, where you're seeing in presidential administrations, when they lose unified control of government, look to move their agenda through executive orders and administrative actions. And the reason we believe that you're seeing more and more concern about public policy in the business community is because control of government is changing so frequently. The parties are unwilling to work together to build bipartisan consensus to pass durable legislation that is going to last for years to come. And thirdly, because administrations are looking for ways to move their agenda through the administrative process. And what that means is the next administration can just come in and undo what the previous administration does. And that creates a lot of instability. Next slide, please. So every year, like you all do, the US Chamber hosts a State of American Business event. And this year in our State of American Business event, our CEO, Suzanne Clark, in her speech noted that when we look at all of what's going on in DC, the state of American businesses that American businesses fed up. The polarization, the gridlock, the overreach, the inability to act smartly and strategically for our future is making it harder for all of us to do our jobs, fulfill our roles, and move this country forward. So this is the environment that we are faced with in DC. These are the headwinds we are dealing with in trying to get our agenda forward on behalf of you all and businesses across the country. Next slide, please. But that's not going to stop us. We still have a job to do, and there are, as we discussed at the beginning, particularly with all the economic challenges, the lack of workers, we need government to work. We need Congress to step up and pass bills to address things like the workforce, reforming our broken immigration system so that we can bring in more workers legally to fill the jobs that we don't have workers in this country to fill. And that includes addressing border security. We need Congress to step up to address the lack of affordable childcare, which is increasingly a reason that a lot of workers who are on the sidelines have cited for not coming back to the workforce. We need to enact meaningful permitting reform. We've put out a lot of money over the past few years for infrastructure investment. That money is going to do no good if it takes longer to build those projects or it takes longer to get the permits for those projects than it does to build them. And we need to be on the lookout for federal regulatory overreach. We are, as I've already said, we are seeing time and time again, irrespective of who is in the White House, administrations are trying to expand the reach of federal rulemaking, enact policies that the Congress has not given those agencies the authority to enact. And then lastly, we do need to raise the debt ceiling. We cannot afford to see the federal government default on its debt. It would be economically catastrophic. So those are our priorities for this Congress. In the interest of time, I will leave everything else to Q&A, and I want to hand it over to the rest of the panelists. So thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Chris, to that point, before I get to the other, this thing, before we get to the other panelists, I want to ask you a question about your presentation. What's great about having you here is you obviously talk to chambers in incredibly diverse areas, incredibly diverse states, incredibly diverse cities, from the Seattle and King County Chamber to the Rawlins, Wyoming Chamber. Is there one sort of uniform concern that you hear from chambers throughout the West that maybe supersedes all other concerns regarding the federal government?
It's the lack of workers.
Okay.
Every single community I go to, they say the same thing. There are no workers. And particularly in the West, where you've seen a lot of people move from California, move from the Midwest, move from the East Coast during the pandemic because of remote work. They've started businesses and they can't find workers to fill those roles. And then secondarily to that is what I hear from a lot of the smaller communities where they're struggling to fill jobs is, even if we could fill these jobs, we don't have the housing for these workers. And unfortunately, we can do something at the federal level when it comes to the workforce. Like I said, we can do more to provide affordable childcare, and we can seek to fix our immigration system to bring in more legal workers. But at the federal level, addressing the housing situation is a lot more difficult, and that's more of a state, local issue.
Got it, got it. Great. Well, speaking of which, we're going to have Andrew Desmond with the Oregon Business Council come up and give his presentation from the state level.
All right. Thank you all for having me. I'm Andrew Desmond with the Oregon Business Council. And before I get started, I just have to acknowledge that you guys are probably wondering why this Yahoo is up in front of you wearing a suit with a blue linen shirt underneath it. This is because there's a beautiful white Crip shirt waiting for me back home that I forgot to bring down last night. So you'll just have to bear with me. Perhaps you can Photoshop in a white shirt for all the photos that come out of this. So as was mentioned, I'm the Economic Development Policy Director at the Oregon Business Council. Folks often wonder what the Oregon Business Council is. There's all sorts of different organizations that have business and Oregon in them, most notably Oregon Business and Industry. Even I stumble with it, which is one of our close partners. They are a trade association, whereas we are a CEO roundtable with about 40 members, many of whom represent the largest or most prominent companies in Oregon. And our mission at the Oregon Business Council is to mobilize business leaders to contribute to the state's thorniest issues. Bread and butter in our portfolio is stuff like economic development, education, and workforce policy, but we touch all sorts of other issues that I won't go into necessarily, but we're doing a lot on homelessness, particularly in the Portland region. Housing is a major issue that we work on, but again, those are not necessarily issues that I touch on. So we were all asked to, or at least I was asked, I'm guessing you guys were asked the same, to reflect on the top 2 things that I'm watching at the state level. And as you'll see, the 3 things that kind of rose to the top for me are federal industrial policy and its impact on Oregon. Second, again, related to Chris's presentation, our need to get our regulatory house in order to ensure that we can kind of maximize the opportunity that's flowing from these federal investments. And then lastly, what changing demographics mean for workforce and productivity in Oregon. So, next slide. We'll just hang on this slide here. It's not very interesting. We have a set of time-limited federal investments that coming down the pike that would each amount to a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Thankfully, there's 3 of them that we have in front of us right now. First, over the last 2 years, there was the CHIPS and Science Act, and that's something that OBC has been really involved in on the Oregon side, helping to convene the Oregon Semiconductor Competitiveness Task Force. And there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of artfully titled, but really is about stimulating clean energy and renewable energy transition in America. And then the last is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I'll probably be spending a little bit less time talking about today. So together, these things might represent the biggest opportunity our state has ever seen, and I'll kind of get into that. So what's behind the massive push? Next slide. I think many of you are probably aware of some of the stuff in these slides, so I won't really belabor them. But first is that we've kind of entered this period of what some are calling deglobalization. So what this chart is showing, and it's probably hard for you guys to see in the way back, since 2008 to basically the present, an index of trade has declined for the first time since basically the 1940s, the conclusion of World War II. So this is kind of it's a result of a number of things converging at once. There's nationalism, but really in recent years, it's kind of these rising geopolitical tensions, particularly related to China, and also the desire to minimize the fragility of globally distributed supply chains like those that we all know were wrecked during the pandemic. So you put those 2 together, and there's increasing interest from both companies and from the federal government to reshore, to nearshore, friendshore, especially critical and important supply chains. Next slide. So at the same time, there's this massive global push to transition to clean energy sources, and that's what this chart here is showing. Basically, the huge drop off in source of energy coming from fossil fuels and the huge ramp up in renewable energy production. Here again, we're exposed to a massive supply bottleneck in China. So for example, China is by far the global leader in battery technology and also battery production. So again, that exposes us to supply chain fragility, and as geopolitical tensions mount, it creates a challenge for us as we race against the clock on climate change. Next slide. So, and sorry for the squiggly lines. This was me highlighting it with my mouse, which isn't so great. The result is this renewal in U.S. industrial policy that you've been hearing and seeing in headlines and in all the major national papers. And part of this push for industrial policy is coming with massive public investment. So basically $30 billion amongst all the investment in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is really about roads and bridges and all that kind of stuff. But they snuck about $30 billion in there for clean energy technologies and electric vehicles. Then $52 billion to reshore semiconductor production, along with another $170 billion to basically make sure that over the next 10 to 20 years, the US is the national leader in all sorts of strategic technologies. And then lastly, $370 billion that came through the Inflation Reduction Act to transition us more quickly to a renewable energy economy. So what could this mean for Oregon? Unprecedented opportunity. Next slide. So this was a slide taken from one of the decks that we did with the Semiconductor Task Force. Research has been done from folks like the Boston Consulting Group that suggests that the CHIPS Act is going to stimulate at least $280 billion in private investment nationally. Currently, Oregon has 15% of the national semiconductor workforce. If we were to get 15% of that $280 billion investment opportunity, that would be $40 billion invested into the state of Oregon, which by our calculations would return something like $10 billion annually in state and public, or in state and local tax revenues, something that is just absolutely mind-boggling. Next slide. Then the folks at Goldman Sachs, generally thought to be pretty good with their numbers, think that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to stimulate $3 trillion of total investment in the renewable energy economy. So they segmented it across these various sources, probably hard for some of you to see. Power networks is that big one in blue. Buildings and heat pumps is this one in brown. One thing I'm confused about with this chart, they say 3 trillion of investment, but it only goes up to 2 trillion. Don't ask me, ask them, but the fact remains that it's 3 trillion is a massive number. Now, Oregon generally is thought to have about, well, not thought, the numbers show it, we have about 1% of the national population. So if you think that we were to just get 1% of this $3 trillion, that would be 30 billion invested in the state of Oregon over 10 years. And I think there's probably a good reason to think that we could get more than just 1%. So you put these two things together and we're looking at $70 billion potentially invested in the state of Oregon over 10 years. And I think many would be hard pressed to think of a more extraordinary economic development opportunity that we've seen in recent years. Next slide. The issue, though, is that a lot of these investments, this is for semiconductor investments and also major clean energy related projects. A lot of these investments have been going elsewhere. East Coast, Southeast, Southwest, in our opinion, has really been stealing our lunch. And so that's part of the reason why we convened the Semiconductor Competitiveness Task Force, to make sure that the state in the upper left corner that has 15% of the national semiconductor workforce starts to get a few more of those dots. But the fact remains still for how are we going to make our state more competitive for some of these clean energy investments and all that kind of stuff. So that leads me to the next section, next slide, which is in order to do this, we really need to get our regulatory house in order. And next slide again, sorry. And when I say regulatory house, defining this in kind of the broadest sense possible, this is essentially the strategy that came out of the Semiconductor Competitiveness Task Force. Found that we need to modernize the incentives that we're offering. We need to address the severe bottleneck in industrial lands that I'll mention in a second. We need to get our regulatory, in the strictest sense possible house in order. Environmental regulations were the things that were most pertinent to members of the semiconductor industry. but I know that manufacturers and employers all over the state are really struggling with things like employment regulations and things like that. And then, of course, there is addressing the severe shortage that we have in talent and workforce across our manufacturing segments and across our industries. Next slide. One area that we've been especially clued into is the major impediment that we see with industrial lands all over the state. So manufacturing is a space-intensive endeavor, and it's often in industrial zone. So a few months ago, we did a survey with some of our partners and found that basically 57% of the cities that were responding, and I tried to look and I didn't have time. I couldn't remember if Springfield responded to this or not. I know Eugene did. But 57% of the cities that were responding have missed economic development opportunities simply because they don't have enough development-ready industrial land. And we also found that of the industrial land that we have zoned industrial, only 21% of that is development ready. So an example of this, how this comes together is a major battery manufacturer comes to Oregon, says, I need 100 acres, 200 acres, and I need to start building now. It's extremely unlikely that they would find any place suitable in Oregon. And that would mean that they would just go to the next best place simply because they have land that is ready to be developed. Next slide. I know I probably only have a couple more minutes, and my colleague over here is probably going to get more into this, but the last bit, and next slide. So we have kind of moved into this environment of structurally declining workforces or labor forces as a percent of our population. That's primarily because members of the baby boomer generation are starting to retire kind of en masse. Next slide. At the same time, we've recorded the first population decline since 1980. And the trend on population growth has been declining. In part, that's because birth rates are declining, but also part of that is because people are moving out of Oregon, which gets me to the last slide that I have here, which in large part, or not in large part, but certainly in part, is because it's more inaffordable to live here due to housing relative to our incomes. So there are a couple of ways that this could be addressed. First is improving affordability, so we can attract people to Oregon and we can keep them here, which hopefully should work to address some of our talent shortages. But the other piece, and the one that I think I'm most interested in, is productivity. How do we make the people that we have more productive to address this kind of structurally challenging environment that we have on workforce? So one thing that, and part of the reason why I'm interested in this is because it's a conversation that I don't often hear going on with legislators or even in our circles with at the Oregon Business Council. We're primarily focused on how we are reskilling or upskilling the people that we have to make them more productive, which is absolutely a vital strategy. But less talked about is how we can improve productivity through various capital investments, whether that is automation or robotization or AI, which we're hearing a lot about. And I think that's something that's worth a lot more discussion and focus on the state level as employers continue to face challenges with their workforces. So that was it for me.
Andrew, before you sit down, a question for you in terms of, obviously it seems like the housing crisis is such a brick wall to attracting and retaining knowledge-based workers. Could you put a little bit more color around what can a local chamber do to help you at the state try and break through that brick wall?
Oh man, you're asking the wrong guy. I said at the beginning, we work on housing policy, but it's not necessarily my bread and butter. I think what the governor has done over the last few sessions, both as speaker and now as governor, it's your top priority. A lot of folks in the business community, at least that we speak to at the Oregon Business Council, are cautiously optimistic about what's going on the state level. But the proof is going to be in the pudding. Right now, the narrative that is kind of still out there is that housing is a major challenge in addition to some other issues related to public safety. But we're hopeful that with all the changes that the governor has made through legislation and through investments, that hopefully that narrative is going to start to change to say, wow, look at all the housing that is being developed all over Oregon, and shoot, it's no longer housing that is the biggest impediment to my ability to attract and retain talent. So I know that didn't answer your question, but it's kind of how we think about it.
Got it, got it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. So now we're going to hear from our last speaker on the panel, Henry Fields with the Oregon Employment Department. Come on up.
Thank you so much. First, I have to see if I have the magic touch. Well, maybe, no. All right, well, next slide wasn't too disruptive for y'all. So real quick, I just wanted to say thank you all for being here this morning. It's great to be with you. I see a couple of faces that I haven't seen in quite a while. It's really great to be back in person with y'all and everybody that's joining us virtually. If you haven't had an opportunity to work with me, I am Henry Fields. I work for the State Employment Department, but I'm an economist that covers the Lane and Douglas County area, which means basically my job is to make sure that you have access to the data that you need. So I'm going to go over a little bit about what's going on in our local economy, both statewide and then even down to the Springfield city level. But just know the type of things that I'm presenting are the sort of things that I provide to businesses all the time, to decision makers. So if there's something you see here that you want to know more about, or you want to talk about, I'd love to be working with you. That is my role, and that's what I love doing. So let's give it an Oregon state level view and then zoom in down to what we can say about Springfield. So this is job change since the beginning of COVID. So the zero level will be February of 2020, before the recession started. Month by month, how many jobs we've lost on a percentage level. This is for the Oregon state level. And as was mentioned previously by Chris, as well as at the national level, at the Oregon level, we have recovered the number of jobs that we did in February of 2020. Next slide. But in Lane County, that actually is not the case. We've not yet recovered to where we were in February of 2020. So this is on the exact same scale as the previous slide. This is that same thing, but just for Lane County job change. So we're still, depending on the month you look at it, 2 to 3 percentage points down in jobs, which is a concern. And a lot of questions I get are, why exactly is that? It's a pretty complicated answer, but more or less it has to do with the types of industries that were really affected in 2020 being a little bit more concentrated here. We have some other unique things that make it more difficult, but important to know, in context of the Great Recession, for example, at this point in the Great Recession, we were still losing jobs, or we had about bottomed out. So this is still a substantial recovery, and we lost more jobs essentially overnight than we did during the worst part of the Great Recession. So two very different experiences in terms of a recession, but it is still the case. So we have some jobs left to gain. Next. This is what we can say for Springfield. This is a different data source, so it's not exactly comparable, but it is the same scale and a little bit further back in time. It's a little bit delayed when it comes out. But you can see a couple things here. According to this, at least, job losses were not as severe in Springfield, and we have almost, or maybe, at this point, especially a couple months later on, probably recovered the number of jobs in Springfield, UGB in particular, which is how this analysis is done. So that, similarly to the question of Lane County, that has a lot to do with the types of businesses that are concentrated here and our experience in this recession. Next slide. And here's where where that comes out in terms of where Lane County is at. This is the job change in Lane County by particular industry, right? So the ones that have had a better experience happen to be a little bit more concentrated in a place like Springfield. But this is just for Lane County, for example. We have big gains from January 2020 to 2023 in financial activities, manufacturing doing quite well, mining, logging, construction, and then really crucially, leisure and hospitality. That's restaurants, hotels, things like that were very severely impacted in 2020. This is a real bright spot because even though there's only 1% growth over those 3 years, the state actually hasn't recovered the number of leisure and hospitality jobs that it had. And there was, based on where you look, basically about 50% of jobs lost in 2020. So huge gains to come back to that. That being said, overall, on a not seasonally adjusted basis, about 3% down in jobs, and bigger losses in things like local government. That's things like local education in particular. Private education and health services is a really interesting and crucial one because there's a lot going on under the surface there. But primarily we're talking about healthcare, social assistance, that kind of thing. And then things like other services and information, which include a whole grab bag of industries, some of which are doing okay and some of which are clearly still left to regain some jobs. Next slide. Now, this is looking at Springfield in particular, and this is in 2021, how our jobs were broken down by those industries that I just talked about, okay? So, and one kind of cool thing about Lane County and then Springfield in particular is a pretty diverse economy that's even somewhat distinct from Lane County overall in a way that I think is really interesting and serves us very well, as we can see from the 2020 recovery, for example. So anything that's in green on this chart, we have more jobs as a percentage of our total than in Lane County. Anything in red, a little bit less so. So we have a big part of healthcare and social assistance, big part of retail. We have more accommodation and food services jobs, more construction, about the same level of manufacturing, but that's more than the US overall. So pretty diverse economy, a little bit less in education, pretty clearly, because a major education employer happens to be right over the Willamette River. Other services, professional services, but you can see we're not, I don't know if Springfield ever really had this reputation, but definitely not a company town. It is not the kind of place where we rise and fall by one industry. Next. And this is a little bit longer term look at. So we've talked a little bit about what's going on right now, what's projected to happen in the next couple of years in these presentations. The Oregon Employment Department puts together 10-year job projections, and our most recent ones are 2021 to 2031, to look at which industries are projected to add jobs in that time. And overall, pretty good news for Lane County. That is, no major industry is projected to lose jobs, and a lot of that is built on our kind of historical basis of being a net attractor of people, and we've talked about that's getting a little bit more complicated in recent years, but also a diversified economy with relatively good access to demand for goods and services, that sort of thing. So you can see big growth in leisure and hospitality. That again is driven by the fact that 2020 was a very bad year for leisure and hospitality. So a lot of that growth may have already happened during the 2021, 2, 3 type era. But also growth in health services, construction, a little bit slower growth in things like financial activities, information, and government. But overall, kind of broad-based growth, which is not true in every region of the United States, obviously. So, relatively positive outlook in that longer term. Next slide. Now, this is really where the rubber meets the road, as was mentioned by Anders a second ago. The availability of workers is really the critical issue right now. So this shows unemployment in Lane, Oregon, and in Springfield, which isn't seasonally adjusted, which is why it jumps around a little more, that blue line. You can see in the grand context of the last 15 plus years, we're at a very low unemployment rate. It has somewhat, in some ways of looking at it, come up a little bit in recent months, but we're still looking at almost as low as it was in about 2019, which is the lowest it had been in a very long time. In the US, it's actually at record lows, like since the 1960s. So we're a little tiny bit higher here in Oregon. Not necessarily sure that that's such a bad thing, given how difficult it is to find workers already. But unemployment, remember, measures the availability of a worker who is not employed right now, that is available for work and looking for it actively. So it really represents our baseline understanding of who's available for work and what kind of workers are available to be hired. Next slide. Last kind of big issue I want to leave you with. This is something that people probably have different levels of fluency with, but this is something that comes up in essentially every presentation I give because it's an important economic base setting context. So this is the annual average wage in 2021 in the US, Oregon, and Lane. And this is a pretty consistent finding over the years. It changes the ratios and the levels, but generally speaking, in Oregon, the average worker earns less than the US, and in Lane, significantly less than that. You can see Springfield's a little bit higher. This is based on where a business is located, not where a worker is located. But we do not have time to get into my dissertation about the various things that go into this, but just know that that's a really important context, especially in a world of, for example, higher housing costs. Workers earn less on average in Lane County than in the US and in Oregon and face higher housing costs, so that's a big concern. Next. This is my contact information. We'll have more Q&A, but I just want to share, if you're not aware, we do have a website, qualityinfo.org, that presents a lot of the data that I did here, as well as my publications and presentations. So we have access to a lot of the sort of things that I presented here today, and I look forward to hearing any questions that folks have. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry, so much. I have a quick question for you in terms of some numbers around what is the difference, or maybe it's a shocking difference in employment rates between sort of the more rural areas in Oregon or Lane County and the more urban areas?
Good question. So 2020 was actually, so typically in a recession, what happens, for example, the Great Recession, rural areas were hit harder and took longer to recover. There's actually a kind of a reversal of that in 2020 because of, again, the industry's affected and the fact that, for example, it's easier to socially distance in a construction or manufacturing that's more important in a rural area. So the kind of tendency has been rural areas were not hit as hard and recovered faster, although in general, like for example, if I compare to Douglas County, there's been kind of a bottoming out. They also haven't quite recovered and hasn't seen quite as much growth in the last year. So there's kind of differing winds kind of cross at that point, but that was the initial impact, and that's where we are today, still a little bit underwater in many Southern Oregon rural areas.
Got it, great. Okay, well, we're going to move into sort of a curated Q&A with the facilitator. That's me. We got together with the staff and came up with some specific questions for each of our panelists. So I'm just going to kind of go through each of these with each of you to get kind of dialed down into even more specifics. So my first question is going to be for Chris at sort of the federal level. And then this may be a hard question to answer, but give us your best guess into what do you think the negative impacts may be for businesses if the fight over the debt ceiling continues into June?
Well, first of all, we still don't know what the so-called next state is, where the Department of Treasury is going to exhaust its ability to use what they refer to as extraordinary measures, these are bookkeeping procedures, to continue paying the bills. Secretary Yellen has said that it's June 1st. The Congressional Budget Office has given us a more general early June, but that could vary depending on what tax receipts look like coming in. But that being said, defaulting on the debt has never happened before. So we don't know specifically what would happen. The best we can do is guess based on what happened the last time we came close, which is in 2011. The last time there was a big disagreement over raising the debt ceiling. And when that happened, interest rates went up, mortgage rates went up, just the general cost of borrowing went up. Our credit rating was lowered. All of those things had a pretty significant impact on the individual's retirement savings and businesses' ability to access credit. If we were to actually default on the debt, meaning we stopped paying the bills, Social Security checks would stop going out, veterans payments would stop going out, Medicare providers would stop getting paid, bondholders would stop getting paid. I think we are all sophisticated enough to know what that would mean for the economy. It would be a significant catastrophic hit to the economy. And the thing that we keep emphasizing here, that this is about paying the bills that the government has already run out. There is a spending issue, it needs to be dealt with, but not raising the debt ceiling is not the way to deal with it.
Okay, great. Andrew, I'm going to ask you a question here, sort of from the state level. What are some opportunities? You talked about this, but put more color around it in terms of competitiveness. What are we missing at the state level to outcompete neighboring states?
I think that question is best answered in particular context. So we had this big effort with the Semiconductor Competitiveness Task Force, the competitive within that, helping us or forcing us to examine how competitive are we with our, the key competitors, like the state of Arizona or the state of New York or Texas or Virginia or North Carolina, basically all the places that you see that are getting all these types of investments. A lot of that has been talked about in the media. So the thing that I'm really starting to get more and more focused on is the piece about our opportunity in clean tech. Just given that $3 trillion number and what it means just on, if we get a normal proportion of that. And I think really, I wish I had a better answer for it, but I think really what we have to do is we have to look at kind of that strategy from the semiconductor work and look at it through the lens of clean tech. Are we offering the right incentives to make sure that these types of entities can grow and expand here? We need to be looking at the specific types of workforces that they need and tying that into our universities, our community college systems, our workforce systems, make sure that they're adequately resourced and prepared to provide the talent that those types of businesses need. And then particularly looking at the regulatory environment. So one of the things that we were really surprised about as we got involved in the semiconductor work was that the length of permits and the uncertainty on those permits in relation to environmental permitting was a massive, massive issue for a lot of our semiconductor makers. That was creating a lot of uncertainty about their ability to invest here because they were looking at timelines that could be 2 or 3 years. And they need to break ground now in this hyper-competitive global market. So there very well could be similar types of regulatory issues for clean tech or for any number of our industries across Oregon that I think we need to get a better handle on. So in some ways, I think that we need, just as the federal government is thinking about industrial policy, because of all these resources, to me, I think in Oregon, we need to start thinking about our own industrial policy, which I think means just focusing in on the key strategic industries that we have and evaluating our strengths and weaknesses against our top competitors, and then taking the appropriate action necessary.
Is there good linkage between your office and the universities that are going to be key in this? Do you feel like they're participating well?
Oh yeah, we're super tight with Oregon State, with the University of Oregon, PSU. All three were involved in the semiconductor competitiveness task force. PCC is an outstanding organization. They were super involved in this, Mount Hood Community College, and scores more. So we do feel like we have the right relationships there. And I wish I could throw up on the screen the logo sheet that we have at the coalition that was supporting this. It's some of the folks that we've talked to. It's our PR guy, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. He said that this was essentially an unprecedented amount of support that we got from a broad swath of Oregonians and organizations that represent Oregonians. So yeah, there's a huge hunger for this, and I think we just need to get out in the community and start working on it.
Great. Question for Henry. If it's 3 or 2 or whatever you want to put numbers around it, what are some of the biggest local impediments for Springfield and Lane County in general to be able to attract workers? Are there regulatory issues that are getting in the way?
Yeah, so I come at this from a context of, sometimes a business will reach out to me and ask for data or information. What's a competitive wage on this? It's a great way to interact with me and help get access to the most recent data. So I may have a biased view in terms of who reaches out to me, but I think some big issues are, as previously mentioned, housing. Basically anything that makes it more difficult than average to hire a worker is going to, in this extremely tight labor market, differentially affect us, right? So the key example, if you can earn less to be a welder here and pay more for your housing, or live in Utah and reverse both of those, in general, it makes more sense to do that as a worker. And workers are mobile. Workers do choose and are attuned to, I can earn several more dollars doing this rather than that. So that's why you see, for example, a lot of the most difficult to fill jobs right now are ones that are either entry level or lower wage, because that wage difference, for example, makes a big difference at that low level. Housing being a key example, again, it's a little bit better here in Springfield if you look across the housing market, but Lane County in general, and then Oregon in particular, we stand out as higher housing costs and lower wages. And then, I don't know if that's necessarily a regulatory issue in that same way, but those are some of the issues that I think businesses are really struggling with, that they don't have a lot of power over. They're kind of, a captive market when it comes to those type of things.
Got it. Let's go back to Chris. Hearing from your colleagues in DC about the easing of inflation, do you feel like it's going to hit a more acceptable point by the end of the year?
Well, that's difficult to say.
Okay.
I think, the best indicator is the Fed, and they have indicated that they are going to pause any further interest rate increases. So they are the agency that watches this more closely than anyone else, and that they're willing to pause their interest rate increases, I think, is an indicator that they're at least optimistic that things are trending in the right direction.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask this question for both Andrew and Henry. Andrew, for you first, in terms of attracting workers and where does the fact that we've had this sort of great migration of workers to remote, how is that, either helping or creating problems in terms of bringing more employees to bear?
Yeah, I think I recently saw some charts on exactly this. It might have been from Josh Lehner at the State Economist Office. I'm looking at Henry because you guys probably talk a lot.
We borrow a lot of this stuff, yeah.
Well, probably vice versa. But it was basically showing that for every percentage increase in housing costs, there's some similar loss of remote type of workers to a more rural area or just kind of an out-of-state thing. So that gets into the chart that I showed, where we had for this last year the first recorded decline in population in many, many years. And so that's a direct consequence of having higher housing costs, and now people shifting to remote work, and they can go wherever they want to. So unconstrained, everything else equal, they're going to places where it's less expensive to be. So Idaho has seen this soar in population, even though the chart that I showed is that they've gotten so many people now that they have a housing shortage, and housing costs are skyrocketing there, but still relative to Oregon, it's less expensive. So yeah, I think there's a direct kind of, a causal, there's causality and correlation between housing affordability and people moving out.
What about you, Henry? Kind of add to that.
Yeah, so two important context things. One, people were more likely to work remotely in Oregon before the recession, so we were a little bit better set up for that. Now, I don't know if y'all remember, but basically kind of early on in the recession, there was kind of this twin discussion about the possibility or the danger of remote work being, maybe Springfield, maybe Lane County is the type of place where tech workers from the Bay Area can live, earn a Bay Area salary, and live at a Springfield cost of living, which relative to the Bay Area, we look very affordable, right? Then there was this other kind of danger of, well, maybe we're the Bay Area in this case. Maybe somebody's not going to want to live in Lane County. They're going to want to live in Eastern Oregon or, Coos Bay or something like that, which is not that much more affordable than Lane County. Bad example, but you get what I'm saying, right? That we might actually be we would not be the benefactor of that. I'm not really sure how precisely we can say, or what segments of the population kind of opted for either of those, or whether people have actually made their final decision on that. But I think that's still a live question. I think with some of the data that you're citing, Andrew, and also our kind of like lower level of job growth, there is a concern that maybe we're not taking full advantage of that. And being well positioned in terms of housing costs and availability is one key way to do that. But I think being aware as time goes on of what does our local mix of remote workers look like? And that's something that's kind of difficult from a data perspective to get a handle on. And I often rely on folks like the Chamber to tell me about what do you hear about workers that work for companies here that are working remotely, or vice versa? Do you have any ideas about how we could better serve those folks? Because I really think that's a critical question that is being answered right now and will kind of be for the next decade in terms of what happens with local economies.
Got it. Chris, doing research for these questions, I know, and you talked about this in your presentation, that one of the U.S. Chamber's big policy goals is permitting reform. Can you add more color around that?
Yeah, and I think Andrew really illustrated this in his presentation, that the federal government has put out a lot of money over the past 2 years, trillions of dollars in infrastructure investment. Be it traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, seaports, as well as green energy projects. This is fantastic. This represents 2 decades of advocacy on behalf of the business community to get it done. But it's important that we actually realize the promise of these investments. And if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that these projects actually get built in a timely way. And right now, under current law, when it comes to transportation projects, it takes on average 7 years to get the necessary federal permits to get those projects approved. For more complex projects, it takes even longer. When it comes to green energy projects, as well as traditional energy projects, they're increasingly struggling to be able to get the permits to site transmission lines. So we have optimism here that something can get done. At the end of the last Congress, Senator Manchin put forward a permitting reform proposal to a Democrat from West Virginia. That proposal attracted bipartisan support. Unfortunately, it didn't get 60 votes that we need in the Senate. And then this Congress, Republicans have included a lot of permitting reforms in their lower energy cost bill that they passed. Obviously, that bill in its entirety doesn't have a future in the Senate, given the current political division. But the permitting reforms do have bipartisan support. And so we feel that everyone is talking about the same thing, and there's an opportunity to get them all in the same room and come to an agreement on actually getting something done to make this process move more smoothly, more transparently, and in a more timely way.
Okay, great. Andrew, as you're talking about, the semiconductor industry and putting up the map and seeing how we're as you eloquently said, getting our lunch eaten, especially look like the South and whatnot. I mean, we do have a lot of land in Oregon. It's in more rural areas. Are there things we can do in rural Oregon to attract the kind of space we need to be able to fulfill that promise of the semiconductor industry?
Yeah, well, it's probably not as much on the semiconductor side as it is potentially on the clean tech or just any other, like, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, Roseburg Forest Products announced a $700 million investment, which is absolutely huge for that community. So there's tons of opportunity for manufacturing all across the state. One of the things that we learned in the semiconductor work is that these folks are laser focused on being in the places where they are proximate to some of the most advanced workers in the world, but also proximate to extremely specialized suppliers. And that just by definition forces them to focus on a couple areas in the metro location, primarily in the Portland metro, but there's still quite a bit of activity that can and will happen in the Eugene area. I think Strata Cash is pursuing a several $100 million investment at the old Hynix facility out here. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in Corvallis. So in terms of building fabs that actually produce the chips, there's probably not as much opportunity in rural Oregon. But one of the things that came out of our work in trying to better understand how the supply chain disperses across Oregon is that just for an example, Intel has 500 suppliers in Oregon that are spread across 15 counties. I think the majority of those counties are rural. Then if you look at their primary construction contractor, those that build their fabs, Hoffman Construction, if you then look at the map for where all of those suppliers are located, I think it touches every county in Oregon except for 2. So I think the opportunities for Oregon, truly Oregon, are vast here. You know, even if it's a fab that is getting built in Hillsboro, that's going to have enormous impacts. You know, for those that are sourcing the timber or are improving the timber or doing metals or chemicals or whatever the case may be, all across Oregon. So I think there's real opportunity there. It's not necessarily as related to land though. And I think on the clean tech side and pursuing that opportunity vigorously, I think the linkages to being to metro areas is probably a little bit looser. And I think that there then is an opportunity to pursue the more available land that we might have in rural areas. So.
Got it. You know, and Henry, this question is for you. You know, we've talked about the fact that Oregon has lost some population, but California has lost population too. Are we still able to attract workers from California? And maybe what's the message that we can do to keep doing that?
Yeah, so we're still kind of figuring out more about what that population loss, which was minor, but it's crucial that it's negative. It hasn't been for 40 years plus. How that's shaking out in local areas. But that aside, one of Oregon and Lane County in particular's biggest assets in all that time has been, we are a net attractor, not just from California, but from almost every state. Basically, the pattern is we attract more people from every state year over year than we send to them, with the exception of Washington. We tend to turn a lot of Oregonians into Washingtonians because, working in Vancouver and living in Vancouver and working in Portland, for example. So a single year doesn't reverse that necessarily, and we can have clear eyes about where we are now in terms of what that is. But that has been an asset in Lane County as well. People tend to move here because it's a nice place to live. It's a relatively, especially to other West Coast areas, affordable area. And there's been that kind of net attraction over. We also have plenty of large facilities like U of O and PeaceHealth that bring people in from the outside, bring spouses along with them, and that is a real economic asset that I feel like is understood but maybe underplayed in a place like Springfield, for example. That has been the tendency for a long time in terms of making sure that we are competitive into the future. Yeah, I think affordability is a key element, at least to the extent of we don't want to see housing costs, since our housing costs are higher, we don't want to be increasing faster than the rest of the US, which has been the case for many years. So we need to maybe equalize that a little bit more. And then thinking really critically about how to bring in somebody that's a newcomer, because this is a very common experience in Oregon. Most people in Oregon were not born in Oregon. To be able to make a place like Lane County or Springfield legible to an outsider, or be able to find work easily for example, a spouse that comes here, somebody that has no experience in this area. These are the type of critical kind of workforce interventions that can make us look like a very attractive place to work above and beyond those simple dollars and cents things, which are important, but do not make up the entirety of why somebody chooses to live and work somewhere, right? So.
Great, great. Well, we're going to open it up now to general Q&A for both the audience here as well as those of you on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, we can kind of do it two ways. You can submit your question to chat and we can read it for you if you'd like us to. I think Danny will do that. Or if you just want to raise your virtual hand and ask a question, we can accommodate it that way. So let's start with the people I can actually see and get a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, the question is for Andrew. You talked about the historic level of investment that is potentially available to Oregon. That money won't be evenly distributed among communities in Oregon. How would you, what would you recommend to a community like Springfield to gain its fair share and more?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think part of it is, and probably the biggest thing is it starts with workforce. As we went through the work with the semiconductor industry, the biggest thing that we heard is the number one factor that they look for, no matter what, is proximity to skilled talent and their ability to attract it there, but also primarily to hire it there. So working with your community colleges, certainly with the University of Oregon, even partners in Oregon State University, which is close enough. To make sure that the programs are in place and that we have enough people going into those fields that semiconductor makers need. Part of it also extends, and this was a big thing that we heard, part of it extends into high schools. And this extends across manufacturing industries. Manufacturing just isn't seen as a sexy career. And in fact, a lot of educators are telling their students that, if you don't go to college, it's a little bit of a failure. And what we're needing to say is that, that's not true. There are extremely engaging jobs that you can get directly out of high school in some of these fabs, et cetera. And so that's a little bit of a culture change that I think we need to pursue in our K-12 system, but it's also something that you can pursue on a local level. If Springfield were to say that we have, one of the most robust pipelines from high school to manufacturing facilities, I think you'd see a lot of interest from folks on that. The big thing, as I said, industrial land is a major issue. A lot of, like, a fab campus ranges from 5,000 to 1,000 acres. Those types of things are probably a little bit less likely to occur down here, but still you're looking at plots of land that probably need to be in the hundreds of acres or more, definitely from 50 to 100 acres. And you can have the best incentives in the world, you can have the best workforce in the world, but if one of these semiconductor makers can't find a place to build here, they'll go elsewhere. So it's essentially the number one prerequisite. If they can't build there, they just have to go elsewhere, no matter how much money that you throw at them. So I think there's that, and then I think the last bit is, it's a little bit prosaic, but it's just how are you telling your story to the broader semiconductor industry? Both fab makers, but their suppliers, and that list of 500 suppliers that Intel has in Oregon, saying, hey, look, Springfield is a great place to do the work here. We have the workforce, we have the regulatory environment from permits and all that type of stuff to get the site going. So just kind of revving up and that's something that a chamber can certainly do. Just revving up essentially the marketing engine, saying that we're a great place to do this and just getting your story broadcasted.
So if I may, lots of pieces there, but I think I heard you say the prerequisite was an inventory of buildable land for these projects.
For sure.
Got it. Do we have? I'm going to try and balance it out. So do we have any questions remotely or in the virtual world?
Yeah, we've got one from Sammy Allen, and maybe Chris, you could touch on this at the federal level, and then Andrew from the state. The question is, what are the business childcare initiatives to attract family-friendly businesses? And I know Chris, you touched on childcare.
We are still looking for those solutions. Just politically right now, the two committees that take this up, Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, which is chaired by Senator Bernie Sanders, and the House Education and Workforce Committee, which is chaired by Virginia Fox from North Carolina, they don't see eye to eye on this issue. And it's getting them to just start talking about this issue and recognizing that something needs to be done at the federal level is the first step. But as far as, right now, it's going to be a struggle to get anything through this Congress on that issue.
Great, we had a question back here.
Yeah, for Henry, with the slides that you had up there, we talked about livable wages, and you compared Oregon, Lane County, and Springfield, how even Lane County had a lower average livable wage than Springfield or the state did. And if we have these land issues to try and attract bigger businesses to come in, but yet we are paying below average livable wages in the county, my question would be, is to attract more business to our area, where does Lane County stack up with the other counties in the state as far as breaking that competitive wage across the board? I mean, bringing business to the state is great, but really, how do we bring more business to our county if we can't pay great wages?
Yeah, so lots to go into here. And again, I'll try not to hijack the entire conversation. This is a really fascinating thing that I think there's a lot of different, basically, streams to look at to how we end up in this situation. But I will say, because I'm a slippery economist with no morals, there is something to be said about the fact that we pay lower wages being a relative asset for businesses that you're attracting, right? So that's the annual average wage per worker. And if you look across most occupations, the general rule is Lane County pays less for the average occupation than the state, and that pays less than the US. That being said, a lot of the reason for our wage difference has to do with the types of jobs that are here. So for example, it doesn't really compare with, for example, in New York City or a Bay Area where you have lots of high wage legal and management careers. So that explains some part of the difference. What I will say is the real key for something like business attraction and retention is that understanding the relationship of individual workers and some of the things that Andrew's talking about the depth of talent within our workforce. We actually have a surprisingly deep, I always find looking at the data, surprisingly deeply talented workforce for a city our size, for example, or for an area our size. Compares very well with a lot of different areas in terms of manufacturing and other types of skilled labor. So being able to use the fact that you don't have to pay an arm and a leg to live here relative to other places while still maintaining that diverse, talented workforce, that's the real line that we have to walk to establish a new business here. And I will say that value proposition is going to look different for a supply chain to a semiconductor facility than it would for wood products manufacturing, that might for healthcare, and there's all these, and it looks different in each of those industries. So it's kind of complicated, but we do have a couple assets in our column in that a deeply talented workforce that doesn't cost quite as much as it would other places. But if we can bring down the cost side of that, it becomes easier and easier to kind of make that a winning value proposition for all instead of just for, top level management, for example. That makes sense.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, so in terms of housing and the increased remote work, you probably either Andrew or Henry, have you heard of any business buildings that are now empty that are being considered turning into housing to address those needs?
That's a major topic in Portland. In fact, I think Portland passed, I should get fact checked on this, but I think they passed some kind of incentive to encourage conversions of office buildings to housing. But yeah, it's a major concern in Portland. It's one of what people think is an existential issue for Portland. Downtown Portland, a guy who comes from Seattle, not that that's like a bustling metropolis like New York City, but you come to downtown Portland and it's a pretty sleepy place in the first place, even pre-pandemic. And now post-pandemic, with concerns around crime and just very little foot traffic, there's a ton of concern about what that's going to mean for the viability of the owners of those buildings and things. In fact, I might be getting out over my skis on this, but the recent Regis building that was just put up there is in a crisis because they were relying on foreign money to buy a lot of those condos. And because of geopolitical tensions, that has kind of fallen off. And these things are priced way above market than what anybody in Portland would pay. So there's a lot of cascading issues that Portland itself is a gnarly challenge. But, yeah.
Yeah, I will say, there are certainly people in the room that are much more well-versed in terms of local commercial real estate than I am. What I will say is you do see that kind of trend, that you see a smaller version of what you see in Portland in a Lane County. So some of those areas that I was talking about that kind of lagged in their job creation post 2020, things like Lane County, Benton, some of the urban counties, those were the ones that actually were the slowest growing for a long time for exactly these reasons. So Lane County probably not as adversely affected as, say, Portland, but it's definitely a concern for us, and I'll be interested to see how well we're able to kind of like move those things from the question mark of the short term to the what's a viable use that we can do in the medium term. So I had that question too.
So I actually have one other thing to add to this. Recently, there was a super great interactive New York Times article that was talking about how feasible it might be to actually convert old office buildings into residential units. And basically, the crux of it is that it's extraordinarily difficult. In fact, it's easier for very old buildings that existed pre-AC. Because those buildings had to have windows that opened to allow for air circulation. And in building codes in urban areas, typically residential units have to have windows that open. But now, particularly in Portland, you have all these buildings that were constructed from the 1950s or to, and on, that don't have windows that open. So that itself is a major challenge. And oftentimes the expense of converting these things doesn't pencil out for those that are doing the conversion. So you either have to look at, do you level up the incentive that you're giving, or folks are going to start getting more and more creative on trying to find a solution. So.
Any questions here in the room? Here we go.
Say Lane Community College here soon is going to be breaking ground on their Industry Technology Education Center, ITech. And do you expect, and that's actually focused on the trades, but it could also include drone pilots to welders, mechanics, electricians. You see that facility and what LCC can bring to bear for the workforce playing a major role in attracting businesses to Lane County.
100%, yeah, that's a huge asset to be able to speak to. The number of students that are coming out with XYZ skills, that doesn't require a college degree. Yeah, that's something major that the semiconductor industry is looking for. And one thing I meant to say earlier is that oftentimes when, at least coming into it, when I was thinking of semiconductor firms, I was primarily thinking of, the super geniuses that are trying to figure out how to get, billions, if not trillions of transistors onto, just a little chip. But what we found is that a little more than 40% of workers in the semiconductor industry actually have community college degrees or less. So these types of things are programs that semiconductor firms look super favorably upon, as do all manufacturers. From Roseburg Forest Products, all the way up to Intel. So
yep, having a that's what I'm talking about, the depth of the workforce. That sort of initiative is exactly because you do tend to focus on the bachelor's degree plus, which is important and an important bottleneck. But perhaps even a more important bottleneck is the factory workers, their ability to do welding that makes it so if you can't assemble the facility in the first place, you're not going to do that high-end work. And so I think innovative programs like that are really, really crucial. We see a lot, again, the most difficult to fill jobs are those skilled trades that have been hard to fill for decades, not just since 2020 thing. So yeah.
And just at the federal level, related to that is, we really need to rethink our higher ed programs. Because right now, all of the federal higher ed program, loan, Pell Grants, are set up for the traditional student. They're not set up for students who take short-term programs or programs that don't require a degree. We need to look at ways where those types of non-traditional students can access things like Pell and federal student Title IV loan programs to take advantage of those programs.
Great. Any questions out there in the universe?
One last question in the chat. If land is not available for shovel-ready projects or housing, how can we change our current needs?
How can we change what?
Our current needs.
Change our current needs. If I'm understanding the question correctly, if the question is how do we work within the constraints that we have, and if it's politically impossible to make more industrial land available, going through the UTV process or the resources that it takes to make that land available, then I think it's just it's really burying yourself in the type of data that we have that says these are the places that we are most competitive in as industries, that we have competitive advantage in, that just don't require the type of land that's needed, or whatever else the case may be. Software is one thing like that. Footwear and apparel typically doesn't need the same type of space. So those things are certainly viable strategies, but typically cater to a more highly educated, higher earning set of the workforce, where we know that we have a real need to address folks that are less skilled, but certainly eminently employed. So.
Are there any other questions in the room?
I have a question. Oh.
You get to. No, you have veto power. Go ahead.
Andrew, you mentioned a couple of times clean tech, and it's very interesting to me because as we look not just the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but the next 10, 20 years of where our economy is going and where our greatest opportunities to leverage some of the technologies that are of interest that will also support some of our traditional industries, manufacturing, forestry, wood products, agriculture.
Sure.
Can you elaborate on what you're seeing the opportunity is in clean tech, maybe even a couple specific examples, and for Lane County, particularly the Willamette Valley?
I wish I had a good answer. It's too soon for me, because I'm really just starting to dip my toes into it as the semiconductor work kind of matures. Really, what I think we need to do as a state is that we need a similar type of task force as we had on semiconductor, but on clean tech. What that means for economic development opportunities, but there's all sorts of billions and billions of dollars for updating grids and all that kind of stuff that is also going to require jobs, but is also just going to make, is required for us to make this transition. I think the most like stereotypical types of announcements that you hear are battery manufacturing plants. We heard that I think it was in the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, might have been in the Inflation Reduction Act. There were a call for proposals for these hydrogen hubs placed throughout the country, and one of those wanted to be in Hermiston, I believe, but it ran into all sorts of issues, and it ended up in the Tri-Cities. But part of that was because they were able to use the clean power that's generated from the Columbia to generate the hydrogen. So we have what is the word? God, just roadblock. Advantages, thank you. Advantages in that regard. Just brush off the sweat there. So hydrogen, but then mass timber, CLT, very much is considered a clean technology that is going to be essential in decarbonizing our buildings. There's another example I saw on a recent chart. Oregon has one of the biggest basalt deposits anywhere in the country, if not the world. And basalt is this like porous rock, I guess, way over my skis now. But it's conducive to the theoretical technology of carbon capture, and through various chemical reactions, the carbon can react with the basalt that sequesters that carbon permanently. So that's an opportunity, particularly on the eastern side of Oregon. So, gosh, yeah, the opportunities abound, but I think, certainly not me, but I don't think many people in the state have their arms around what all the opportunities are, and I think that's something that we need to quickly get our arms around. So.
Thank you.
Well, great. We are exactly on time, so please join me in thanking our speakers. So much great information, great insights, and we look forward to having you back perhaps next year. Vonnie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right. Well, if we have the three of you back, we'll be pleased, but we'll be even more pleased if you come back as well, Michael. So thank you so much. I have 3 takeaways. I was asked to give some takeaways. For Chris, it's a weird economy. For Henry, he's a slippery economist. And by the way, Andrew, it's advantages. You make us all feel better when you slip out. Okay, quick reminders, the climate survey, the business climate survey will be coming out. Look for it in your email boxes. Take it yourself. 10 questions. Give it some thought. We're going to look really closely at this. And by the way, it's not just a one and done. This is ongoing work. We'll be talking with folks like Chris and Andrew and Henry along the way. We'll also be doing some roundtable discussions, pulling together some of our business leaders in economic development, policy, and business and industry. So it's really important. Please take that. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our sponsors, Summit Bank, Oregon Community Credit Union, and PeaceHealth for providing us the opportunity to bring you all together today. And yes, we will see you next year, but more importantly, we'll see you much before then. So stick around if you'd like. Folks tuning in at home, get yourself another cup of coffee. We have some leftovers here, so stop by the chamber and say hello. We'll send you home with some sweet treats. Thank you, everybody, for coming.